1993. A tugboat on a routine towing job.
Clear night, a lot of moonlight.
The crew changes shift at midnight.
Well, I went on to bed, and I was sleeping good.
Suddenly, the boat lists.
I had a bad feeling. Jumped out, I hit the door, I said, what the is going on? I went straight for the wheelhouse.
But the boat is going down, backwards. Water floods into the wheelhouse.
That's when the back one just blew in.
The water washed him right out of the wheelhouse. The Thomas Hebert disappeared forever.
5 men lost. How did it go down? Mechanical failure? A mysterious other vessel? Or something else? I'm in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. I actually used to live just a couple of miles from here. I'm John Chatterton. On March 7th, 1993, it was a clear, cold night 35 miles offshore when the ocean-going tugboat Thomas Hebert mysteriously sank. She took with her 5 of her 7 crewmen. Now, at the time, I actually played a small role in the story of the Thomas Hebert. And the question then was the same as the question now, because it never was resolved. What happened to the tugboat Thomas Hebert? March 5th, 1993. The tugboat Thomas Hebert leaves Newport News, Virginia on her regular route bound for Portland, Maine. She's towing her faithful companion barge, the same one she's been using for 6 years, loaded with more than 8,000 tons of coal. 2 days later, the Hebert is gone. 5 of her crew go down with her. George Coram, mate. Sonny Hatch, deckhand. James Westmoreland, cook. Vincent Blanks, deckhand. Charlie Buck Landers, engineer. Brother of the tug's captain, William Willie Landers. A 35-year veteran of tugs. Miraculously, Willie survives, along with mate Brett Cooper, who started out on the water at the age of 14. How did the Thomas Hebert sink on a calm, clear night? And how could it happen so quickly that 5 crewmen did not get out? 11 years later, the families, crewmates, and survivors are still wondering. They're left with questions and each other.
Great. He was a good guy. He was like a trapeze artist on that boat. Did you ever see him walk on the edges of the tugboat and just fly? He was like amazing. I said, what are you doing? He can balance himself. He was so well like on that tug. He said,
He was at home on a tug.
Mr. and Mrs. Blanks remember well the last day they saw their son. Mr. Blanks drove him to the boat and watched Vincent carry on his gear.
And hugged him, took all his gear on, and for some reason he came back off again to hug me again. He'd never done it before.
He had a black leather coat that he wore, and he usually wore it to meet the boat. And this time he came out and he had his work clothes on and he had his jeans jacket on. And I said, "Where's your coat?" And he said, "I'm not going to take it this time because I'm not going to be gone as long."
Survivor Brett Cooper worked closely with Vincent.
We worked together a lot. He was working in the engine room, and I had a lot of extra time, so I'd help him out a lot. And just awesome kid, awesome. You know, I say a kid, but he was the same age as me then, you know. So, but he was a great guy. Actually, all of them were.
Tony Jones, TJ, was the relief captain on the Hebert. He got off the boat just days before it went down. When divers went to recover the crew's bodies, TJ felt duty-bound to go along and identify his friends.
We were all jokers, you know. We pulled stuff on each other that would probably make some people mad, but that's just the way we were. And you could count on it. So that was my last way of counting on them.
Before we can answer these people's questions, before we can try to solve the mystery of what happened to the tugboat Hebert, I want to go back to the beginning, back to the people and places where this story started for me. I'm at Divers Academy International in Camden, New Jersey. For me, this is where the Thomas Hebert story began, even though I didn't realize it at the time. I came here some 20 years ago to learn commercial diving. And hard hat diving is how I've earned my living. These guys are the underwater repairmen of the world. We don't see their work, yet we depend on it every day. On the bridges and tunnels we use, the power plants that serve us, the underside of ships that carry cargo from around the world. I'm here with Tamara Brown. She's the executive director here at Divers Academy. And she and I were both students here in 1982. And the first dives that you and I made from these waters were with that big Mark V, the heavy helmet, the big breastplate.
And that suit weighed 192 pounds. You remember how heavy it was?
Yeah, I was reminded today. What are the advantages that surface supply diving gives to the diver over, say, scuba technology?
Surface applied diving has an unlimited air source where the air helmet, the air hose is connected to an air compressor rather than the bottle on the diver's back. So you don't have to worry about running out of air. It also has a communication system in the umbilical that's connected to the surface. So the diver doesn't have to worry about getting lost, running out of air, and he has two-way communication with the surface in order to get the job done.
That means it's all about productivity in the water.
Absolutely.
Now, my understanding is there's no such thing as a free lunch. So I'm supposed to get in the water and get to work for Tammy.
Time is money, John. Time is money.
It's just the way it is, too. After I graduated from the academy, I started doing jobs as a commercial diver. It's that hard hat work that would eventually lead me to the case of the Thomas Hebert. I was called in after she went down. When a sinking happens, of course, the right thing to do first is recover the bodies of the crew. Some divers I know were involved, and they were having trouble bringing up all the crewmen. March 12, 1993. Their first dive, 5 days after the sinking, actually goes pretty well. The tug sits in about 130 feet, and it's in remarkably good condition. But their bottom time runs out. And when they try to return, a huge storm with gale force winds hits the East Coast. After that, the recovery effort is much tougher.
The hallways were choked with debris, and when you first saw it, you knew something very terrible has happened here.
The wreck had been pounded almost 20 feet into the sand in that one storm. The conditions were horrible. In addition, the storm really reduced the visibility to barely beyond the length of your arm.
In fact, it's after the first dive that a hard hat diver from another crew loses his life on the wreck.
The hard hat diver's helmet separated from its collar and jettisoned off his head, and unfortunately he drowned. And the next day we came out, their morale was low. Now our morale was low.
Steve, Tom, and John Hulbert soldier on. It takes them 7 dives, but they finally locate all 5 missing crew. Bringing up the last man, Captain George, proves to be a challenge.
Our problem was that the area was very tight for John to get into with his tanks on his back.
The wreck had been compacted so much, and I was able to get in and reach the body, but after tugging for a while, I realized I could not get the body free.
Then John Hulbert realizes there's a problem with his gear.
I knew I had a faulty tank. I probably could have gotten the body if I'd had time, but I knew things were going wrong, and you learn to stay alive. Sure enough, when I got out of the wreck, all my backup air blew away, and I actually conducted the entire dive at 145 feet on one tank.
So we called on a friend of ours, John Chatterton, who's a hard hat diver. Without being impeded with the tanks and just having the hard hat, surface supplied air, he'd be able to get in there much easier than we would. He also had comm gear, so he can actually talk to the surface. And this was how we ended up getting Captain George out.
While helping with the recovery, I kept thinking, what in the world happened to this tug? It's a mystery that's never been solved. Now we're going back to the wreck to see if we can find any evidence to help us with this case. Tom Packer, Steve Gatto, and myself are here in Brielle, New Jersey. We're trying to prepare ourselves for our upcoming dive on the wreck of the Thomas Hebert. Back in 1993, when all three of us were on the wreck, this is where we actually retrieved Captain George's body. So we came in through here, went down the little stairway, down the corridor, down the long set of stairs, came out into the quarters here, and then across over into the head. It doesn't look that far when you look at it on paper.
No, big difference underwater.
Very much compressed. Right now, what we want to know is there anything else that the wreck can tell us about what caused the sinking? I haven't been to this site since 1993. We have no idea what awaits us on the bottom.
John, you ready?
We're off the coast of New Jersey, heading to the wreck of the tugboat Thomas Hebert. She went down fast in calm, clear weather on March 7th, 1993. I'm here with divers Tom Packer and Steve Gatto, who's writing a book on the Hebert. They brought me to this site shortly after she sank 11 years ago. Now we're revisiting the wreck, hoping to find something that helps us figure out why she went down. On the way to the site, we pass a tugboat and barge. Amazing such small boats can tow that kind of weight.
The mindset back in the mid-70s was to build a smaller, more economical tug that had high horsepower because they rented their tugs out based on their bollard pull or their pulling strength. The Thomas Hebert was a 94-foot-long tugboat, 2,500 horsepower. It was the first tug in the United States to get L&S gearboxes, and they turned twin propellers 88 inches in diameter. The barge was 340 feet in length, 62 feet wide. It carried 8,500 tons of coal. It was mated with the Thomas Hebert. These two traveled around for years together. It's like a personality in itself. The tug and the men who crewed it knew exactly how it reacted in certain sea conditions.
In fact, crews' lives depend on understanding how a tug and barge interact with each other. Because a tug can be sunk by the load it's towing, an event called tripping. And according to a Coast Guard report, this is probably what happened to the Hebert. The report suggests that the tug's steering fails due to a broken solenoid, an electronic switch that helps control the rudders. According to this scenario, the failed solenoid forces the tug's rudders hard over, causing her to do a U-turn. Then, the tremendous momentum of the 8,500-ton barge, still moving forward, starts pulling the tug backwards. Water pours in through an open engine room door, and she sinks. If that is what happened, we should find evidence on the bottom. One of the things I'm interested in determining is the lay of the wreck, the direction that the wreck is headed.
John, the anchor line is southwest, 220 degrees.
Perfect, Billy, thanks.
John, you ready?
The tug rests at 145 feet. She's in tough shape at this point, beaten by fishing trawler nets, worn by weather and time. No way we're getting inside the wheelhouse, so we move along her hull. The marine growth is beautiful. Flowers on the Hebert's grave. We come upon the rudder. It's positioned at about 5 degrees. That's odd. It doesn't square with the Coast Guard explanation that a steering failure caused a hard turn. We'll have to delve into that further when we get topside.
The bow is in a northerly direction. That's where they were headed. Well, if they'd turned hard to port and come back around, and as the barge continued north, it would have dragged them. I would expect the bow to be facing south. And that's not what it's like down there. So, the bow's facing to the north. That means they got pulled down backwards, doesn't it?
What a difference 10, 11 years make. What was the most striking thing to you, Tom?
I would have to say the fact that she's turned over a lot more than we expected to see. I mean, it was over about 110, 115 degrees 11 years ago, and now it's 160, 170, almost completely upside down.
What surprised me was that the rudder that we did see was still only 5 degrees. That was one thing that didn't change since 1993. You know, basically what the Coast Guard was saying is that they had a solenoid failure, which caused the rudder to go hard over, both rudders.
That's not what we were looking at.
That's not what we saw down there.
Okay. And the other. So far, we've seen one rudder that does not show evidence of turning hard over, but the second rudder is gone, and we couldn't get into the wheelhouse to check the rudder indicators. And we don't know the maintenance condition of the tug. So we need to find someone who knew the tug like the back of their hand. Someone from the crew. Like the hard hat world that I come from, the tug world is part job, part way of life. To understand this story, you have to understand the world of the men on these tugboats and the nature of their unique fraternity.
These guys were very experienced. They spent a lot of time on the water. Most of them came from backgrounds that were generations of seafarers.
When you got a good, calm trip, you can't beat it. It's like heaven out there. I've seen sunrises and sunsets that break your heart. I've seen killer whales. I've seen it all. And then to get paid to do it is unbelievable. People take cruises. I work on tugboats.
You go on your beginning of your trip. We used to work 20 and 10 rotation there, 20 days on, 10 days off. So you go on the beginning of your trip, well, about the first 4 or 5 days was catching up on everybody's home life. You're actually with them more than you are your own family. You live with them every day, and it's not long before they are your family.
A family that had its own idea of a coat of arms.
They had their own tattoo stencils and machines. Like Charlie Buck, huge guy, had arms like Papa. I mean, his arms like, hands like that. Just a big man, you know. And he's just an old country guy, you know. Tattoos everywhere. I almost broke down one time, but they never did get a tattoo on me. But they wanted me. They wanted me. Because everybody had a tattoo. It was like, it was a thing to do, you know.
They were just comical, fun-loving guys. I remember once Tony throwing a line overboard and the boat was going, and they were all excited. They thought they had a huge fish. I mean, it looked gigantic. And they got closer and closer, and he was yelling at the guys to try to get it in. And got closer, and it was a huge garbage bag. He was so mad, he just threw everything overboard. He had them all down there ready to help him get it in. We thought we was going to have fish for dinner.
If you've never been to sea, and I don't care how big the boat is, it can be 200 feet, it can be 600 feet. When you're at sea, a couple hundred miles at sea, it's little. When you get caught in a couple of storms, 25, 30 footers, it brings you together.
But it wasn't a storm that the crew of 7 faced that night. If we're going to come up with any answers, we've got to talk with some of the Hebert's surviving crew. This is the McAllister Tug Pier, and with me is Tony Jones. Now, Tony was the relief captain on board the Thomas Hebert. What is the difference between the guy that wants to work offshore and the guys working here in the harbor?
Probably the guys want to go offshore a little crazier than the guys in the harbor.
The trip where the Hebert went down, was that like a regular trip? Was that routine? Was this anything out of the ordinary?
That was just as routine as it can be. We have been running coal up to Searsport, Maine, Portland, Maine, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on and off for 5.5 years since we'd got the boat.
In the Coast Guard report, they made some reference to solenoid failures and maintenance problems and that sort of thing.
Any boat whatsoever has its own maintenance problems, you know, just stuff breaks down. Salt water takes a toll on everything, and we fix it.
Well, do you think maintenance played any kind of factor in the sinking of the Thomas Hebert?
Not whatsoever. Not in my mind. From everything I know of it, it played no factor whatsoever. I do not believe she was tripped.
TJ, explain tripping to me.
Well, let's step down on the boat, and I can show you the wire and stuff, and it'll be easier to explain that way.
Okay. This isn't a new tug?
Nah, this is a pretty old tug here. Got a fairly nice...
This is the winch.
The towing winch. And this is the cable. This ain't the same size cable as the Hebert. This is smaller. The way it hooks up is you got a socket on the end that comes out here. And this doesn't have the Texas bar like the Thomas Hebert did, but she had a bar that came out and rolled over with a wheel on it, a roller. Sort of like that one right over there. And you would set the roller up in the center. The cable would go through this roller, and then you tied it down with a chain on the stern side of it and the forward side of it. And the main stress point would be on that roller with that chain. That chain would have broke long before she'd have went over. That cable...
TJ explains that for the barge to pass the tug and pull it around and down, the apparatus holding the chains would have broken.
It would either, if the chain didn't break, it would rip the whole pipe and the roller off of the tug, because you're talking a 9,000 ton of coal with a 300 and something foot long barge drawing 18 foot of water, 1,800 horsepower pulling on it.
Well, now, when we look at the wreck of the Thomas Hebert, what do you see in the towing gear that makes you think that it didn't trip?
We got pictures with her on the bottom, laying in the roller.
TJ says he's talking about a videotape which was shot by John Hebert during the very first dive to the wreck, a tape that was never seen by the Coast Guard. TJ, Steve Gatto, and I are with John Hebert taking a good look at John's video footage of the Hebert.
Yeah, stop that.
He shot most of this just 5 days after the tug went down.
What do you call those chains?
Lockdown. John's a pioneer in wreck diving, and he's on the Marine Forensic Panel of the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers. As we search John's video, it's becoming clear that he collected exactly the evidence we need. Right now, we're inside the wheelhouse. And TJ, what do you see in here that would be important?
The thing that I'm looking at is when it shows the rudder indicator. It's showing that she's got like about 5 degrees port rudder.
Okay, that's right there?
Right there.
Okay.
And if she'd have lost the solenoid switch, she would be hard over.
Now, that's what the Coast Guard report said. There was a solenoid failure previously. It was a maintenance problem. It happened again. But how much rudder is 5 degrees?
That's not very much. It's enough to make the boat turn slowly, very slowly.
If you had a solenoid failure, what kind of inclination would you have?
38 degrees, 42 degrees.
So instead of 38 or 42 degrees, we've got 5 degrees. Watching the tape, it appears that the rudders and indicators are at about 5 degrees. Nothing that would cause a sharp turn. And that's not all. If the Thomas Hebert was forced into a sharp turn, we'd expect to see damage to the towing gear, but it's perfectly intact. What are we looking at, TJ? Is that right there? Yeah.
This is the roller with the cable.
Hey, stop that.
You got the small chain underneath with the 2 shackles, and she's down inside the roller.
So if you put any kind of sizable force to either side, to port or starboard, that lightweight chain is going to break.
Well, even if she didn't break, with that kind of force to pull that boat down, she'd pull the tow bar, the roller, and everything off of the back.
Whatever happened has got to fit the evidence that we look at on this videotape. At this point, we're pretty convinced that the tug did not trip. But how did she go down? We've got to ask one of the survivors to take us back to the night of the sinking. We're in New Jersey investigating the 1993 sinking of the tugboat Thomas Hebert. We've come to doubt the original theory of a steering failure, and we're in search of a new theory. To get a lead on this, survivor Brett Cooper is going to take us back to the night of the sinking. March 5th, 1993. The Thomas Hebert leaves the coal pier at Newport News, Virginia, bound for Portland, Maine.
A couple days into the trip, we just made a course change for Buzzards Bay to go through the Cape Cod Canal. It was probably a 2-foot chop, if that, and it was a nice evening. It was a real nice evening, a real nice ride.
Captain Willie strolled to the back of the wheelhouse to check out the tow. He saw that the tow was riding easy. The barge was riding easily on the end of 1,200 foot of 2-inch steel cable. He then came in, leaving the door open for air, and at 12 o'clock initiated a crew change. He went off watch along with Brett Cooper, and on came Captain George, who took over Willie's place at the helm. Vincent Blanks went down into the engine room to do his routine check. At this point, Willie and Brett Cooper retired and went to sleep.
And of course, I was sleeping. I was sleeping good.
Suddenly, Brett is awakened by belongings falling to the floor.
I just had a bad feeling. I had a bad vibe. I've been around boats long enough. Something just wasn't right. I hit the deck, I come out the door, and I went straight for the wheelhouse. There was nobody around. That's when I guess Willie woke up.
Captain Willie jumped up, ran out to the hallway, and yelled up to the wheelhouse to kick her out of gear.
So I pulled the throttles back.
Brett knew something's drastically wrong. He ran down, got his survival suit.
I grabbed it, I headed back for the wheelhouse.
Meanwhile, there's yelling going on from below. Captain Willie starts his way down the stairs into the galley.
Just then, Brett makes it back to the wheelhouse.
The boat felt like she was coming straight back like this. It was being pulled astern. Something had a hold of the boat. That's when the back one just blew in. The water hit, washed me right out the hatch.
He's freezing cold. The water's 36 degrees. Brett managed to still clutch onto his survival suit, escaping, almost being pulled under by the tug. The Thomas Hebert disappeared forever. He was left in the dark by himself.
It was silent. It was nothing. So I'm thinking I'm all alone. I must have said, oh my God, 100 times.
All of a sudden, the life raft canister comes up to the surface.
So I started swimming for the capsule. And I got probably 5 feet from it, and it deployed.
He hears a hissing sound, and out of the water comes Captain Willie choking, and he's just so relieved. He's like, thank God, somebody else made it from the tug.
And I was in my underwear, and he was totally naked.
Brett has his survival suit with him. He takes it out of the bag and starts to get dressed.
But I was wet, so it was sticking to me. I couldn't get in. I was really freaking out. I finally get inside the survival suit. Then I noticed the barge. She still had a head of steam on her. She was still on her course.
If they could have got on the barge, they could have got down the engine room, fired up the engine room. A, it would have gave them a 340-foot target for the Coast Guard to find, and B, and more importantly, warmth. They think they're home free when all of a sudden, as the Thomas Hebert is sinking to the bottom, it's trying to pull them down with it.
The painter didn't release. So the raft starts digging through the water, and the water's just flooding over the top of this raft. It was like dive, 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 you know, and it's just like this, just biting. And I screamed to him, I'm headed for the barge, and I no longer got that out of my mouth, and then the painter parted. So we were set free of the boat, but then we were full of water. So I decided to try to row to the barge. Well, the wind started picking up a little bit. Besides that, the raft was full of water. There's no way. It was so cold, I couldn't do it. But I started ripping open the containers, trying to find some flares. I found the old sulfur type flares, and we're striking them, we get them licked. So we're standing up, we're waving these, you know, and the sulfur drips on the raft. So I'm like, this is one thing after another.
Sparks from the flare actually deflated the canopy to the raft.
What could went wrong did go wrong, you know. It was just amazing, absolutely amazing.
They were worried that it was going to put a hole in it and actually sink the raft. So they stopped shooting any more flares off. It was a waiting game now. They elected to stay with the life raft for help to come to them.
We didn't know what to say, you know. Nobody knew what to say. I was wore out. We were wore out. I actually just sit back in the corner and was just kind of giving up a little bit, you know.
They lost very close friends. Also, when you don't know if anybody's ever going to come for you in such cold water, you got to wonder if, like, you know, is this how I go?
They're exhausted, and after being immersed in 36-degree water, hypothermia is setting in. Hours go by. Night turns to day.
Luckily for them, a fishing vessel passed close enough by and picked them up, brought them on board their vessel.
Give us clothes, you know, blankets. They were real good. The captain was really the only one that spoke good English, but the rest of them, they were good people. They were good people.
Then the call goes out to the Coast Guard.
Do you think this is safe, or do you think they're better on the boat? They're move back and left. They're coming up. I'm bringing them up slow. Bring them up slow. Hold altitude. We'll move back and left. They're move back and left. Thank God.
Like winning a lottery. Next thing to winning a lottery without the money. Bottom line. Bottom line.
The Coast Guard keeps looking for survivors. None are found. And from the time you woke up till the time you hit the water, I know it's tough, but how long do you think that was?
A couple minutes tops, if that.
That's pretty fast.
That's real fast. We have a cook that gets up every morning around 4:30, cooks breakfast. He was up a little early that morning, and he was on the head. He was in the bathroom. When they found him with his pants down, and I think it was a broken nose, and whatever hit us so hard that it snatched him off the toilet and into the laboratory, into the sink.
Sure. Sudden.
Sudden.
And severe.
And severe. So that didn't happen just over a casual period of time. That happened like right now.
Now, when you came up to the wheelhouse, there was nobody there.
No.
So we just don't know what they were doing, if they were aware of a problem and trying to address it, or
no.
We just don't know.
No, we don't. I don't personally know.
What was the crew doing? That's probably one question no one will ever be able to answer. But there is more we can do to find out what could have taken the Hebert down so fast. We're meeting with two University of Pennsylvania scientists who conducted tests on the tow cable. Dr. Laird, a professor of materials science and engineering, and Dr. Lee, a project manager. Tom, you were involved with the recovery of the cable. What observations did you make at the time?
Well, as we were stretching it out, of course, we used a truck to pull it off the drum. And, you know, we thought there was nothing special about it. You know, we didn't realize there was anything until the truck stopped and the cable was released from the drum. And then it just took on a shape of its own, looked like a snake going across the parking lot, a couple, you know, curled around.
This spiraling is rather similar to how you make a gift wrapping, when you take the ribbon and you put a nail against it and run it along, and then you let it go and it curls up.
Sure.
So it was the same kind of mechanism. So we were interested in knowing where that might have come from.
There were some traces of paint on the cable also?
There were traces of paint, and we actually sampled from the barge, because one of the theories that we investigated was whether or not the barge had overrun the cable. That was the theory at that time. And we compared the paint that we found on the cable against the paint that was on the barge, and they were just different.
Dr. Laird tells us that when they tested the substance found on the cable, it turned out to be a high-grade stainless steel.
The discovery that it's stainless steel pointed out that this was unusual.
It wasn't a transfer that occurred while Tom and the rest of the men are recovering the cable.
No.
This is a high-temperature transfer.
This thing whatever hit it produced so much friction at microscopic areas of the cable, it made it white hot. And then, of course, as it slid past that area, it would be immediately quenched by the seawater. And that the history of that event is recorded in the structure of the cable.
Traces of it weren't found throughout the entire length of the cable.
No, it was localized where the deformation damage was.
Professor Laird, when you look at all of the aspects of your inspection of the cable, what kind of conclusion can you come up with?
The conclusion is definite, that we believe that this cable was struck by something massive, fancy, in that it has on it materials not usual for ordinary vessels, and had to have been a significant force to have been able to drag a tugboat backwards underwater. Which particular vessel and where it came from, of course, we have no basis.
Professor, thank you very much.
Thank
Doctor, thank you. So it's starting to look like another vessel might have sunk the Hebert. But the circumstances surrounding this sinking are so varied and complex, we need somebody that can help us put all the pieces together. We're Jersey investigating the 1993 sinking of the tugboat Thomas Hebert. Now I've come to meet Bruce Belasovsky, a naval architect and marine investigator who worked on this case. Bruce, what kind of experience do you have in reviewing reports like the one that the Coast Guard issued?
Over the years, I've looked at a number of investigations that were completed by the Coast Guard. Also, I spent a total of 24 years in the Coast Guard and retired in 1994 as a commander.
What about the report that they issued on the Thomas Hebert?
There was never any hard evidence that there was a steering failure on the Thomas Hebert. And tow trips at sea are very, very rare. They can occur, but they're very rare.
They felt that one of the watertight doors that was left open created a very rapid flooding, and this was critical to their theory on tripping, correct?
We looked at that, and we looked to see if we could get some correlation between a flooding through that door and sinking of the Hebert. We don't get a correlation in time whatsoever. And I might add that that watertight door was actually allowed to be open by the stability standards that the tug, had at that time. These two survivors, Willie Landers and Brett Cooper, were able to actually get into a life raft out of the water and still saw the running lights of the barge coming at them and watched the front running lights of the barge pass them by, which means that this tug never tripped. The Coast Guard themselves, at a higher level of review, also could not concur that there was anything that specifically pointed to a tow trip.
Is it possible that the tow cable could have snagged some stationary object already on the bottom?
That possibility is fairly unlikely. There was a sonar search that was done in the vicinity of this, and it was shown that there was nothing there that could have done this.
What other theories are out there?
The only other theory that has been bandied around then is the Hebert was in fact pulled backwards and down by a submarine.
This is a pretty unlikely event, though.
It's actually not that unlikely. Almost a parallel incident occurred several years before the Hebert was lost on the West Coast, that being the tug Barcona and the USS Houston, with almost an exact same set of circumstances.
In Southern California, the Navy is investigating an accident involving one of its nuclear-powered attack submarines. The USS Houston snagged a tow cable as a tugboat was pulling a barge and sank the tugboat. One of the tug's crew members is missing.
So sub-accidents involving tugboats have, in fact, occurred before. But is that what happened this time? If you were going to draw parallels between the evidence that you collected on the Thomas Hebert and the Barcona incident, what do you think makes the strongest case for there being a similarity between the two?
The rapidity of this incident, that this whole incident occurred somewhere between a minute to a minute and a half. And I've always felt that the cable evidence in both cases was probably the strongest parallel.
And that's physical evidence.
That was hard physical evidence, and they were so incredibly similar that I felt that to be the strongest evidence.
Naturally, the guys on board a nuclear submarine, they got to be real concerned about the stability, the safety, and the integrity of their vessel at the same time. So what do? With the Barcona, they stop, they make sure everything's okay, and that would make me less inclined to think it was a U.S. Navy submarine. I think the U.S. Navy would have reacted the same way they did in the Barcona.
The Houston did.
The involvement of a submarine from any country was explored by Ed Cattell, a lawyer for the owner of the Hebert.
We started with Freedom of Information Act inquiries to the United States Navy. We also had a report from the father of one of the victims, one of our crewmen, that a U.S. Navy submarine had come into the Norfolk Navy base in the dark of night in an unscheduled call for emergency repairs. So we focused our inquiries on that submarine.
The Navy reported that the sub in question, USS Newport News, had been scheduled for regular maintenance several months prior and that it had no unusual damage. They also stated there were no U.S. Navy subs within 100 nautical miles of the Hebert's sinking.
If it wasn't a U.S. Navy submarine, whose was it? Well, somebody else's. So we asked the Navy for help, and we said, if there was a foreign submarine there, would you know about it? Classified, we can't tell you that. They did suggest, however, that we might want to look at Jane's fighting ships. So we did. And we found that the Soviet Union builds an extremely large fleet diesel submarine. Jane's fighting ship also indicates what other countries have fleets of this Foxtrot-class submarine. There is a fleet of those submarines located on an island just south of Florida. So I personally concluded that this was a likely candidate.
Nobody seems to doubt that whatever sank the tugboat Thomas Hebert, it was an extremely unusual event. But with the evidence we have so far, we just can't be certain what it was. And that's the one thing we'd like to be able to give the families.
A lot of families don't have closure to the big question of what happened. That was the driving force behind us to keep going back to the wreck and keep collecting evidence, and then to start researching these things out and try to find out what really happened that night.
I think that if attention was brought to the fact that this happened and they were important, that would close it for me, I think. It still hurts. You learn to live with a big old hole in your heart when this happens. But it's consolation for me to know that he loved doing what he was doing.
For the families, the loss of the Hebert will always be painful, even if an answer is found. At this point, we think we can rule out both a tow trip and something on the ocean floor catching the cable. It looks like another vessel was involved. But it's entirely possible that we're never going to completely solve the mystery of the tug Thomas Hebert. We don't have a smoking gun yet.